The Senate was determined by lot. As a result, I inform the Senate that the following letter has been received from Senator Collins. Dear Mr President, pursuant to Standing Order 75, I propose that the following matter of public importance be submitted to the Senate for discussion: the government's tax plans that are fiscally reckless, less progressive and fail Australian jobs. Is the proposal supported? Thank you. I understand that informal arrangements have been made to allocate specific time to each of the speakers in today's debate. With the concurrence of the Senate, I ask the clerks to set the clocks accordingly. Senator Ketter.
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Deputy President, and I rise to make a contribution in respect of this debate. And it's quite clear that the government's tax plans are fiscally reckless, they are less progressive, and they do fail Australian jobs. And it's good to see in the newspapers today that for once there was accurate reporting of the Labor position in respect of this particular issue, and there was some reporting around the issue of the Senate Economics Committee's report in relation to these to the personal income tax cuts. And as Deputy Chair of the Senate Economics Legislation Committee, we had the opportunity to participate in an inquiry, and the Labor senators handed down a dissenting report in relation to that bill. And during the course of our dissenting report, we accused the coalition of abandoning all hope of budget repair, and this we also talked about the fact that this government has an abysmal record on debt and deficit by attempting to legislate for this full package of personal income tax cuts, given the well-known downside risks to Australian fiscal and economic position. So this position that the government has taken on personal income tax is absolutely irresponsible. And what we saw in the course of the Senate inquiry into the bill was this government has adopted an ideological approach to income tax reform, whereas the government should be looking at outcomes and should be looking at whether or not its income tax reform is directed at improving workforce participation, or is it directed at improving consumer spending. No, these are not the issues that the government has been looking at. Their approach is an ideological one, and it comes down to a mantra of lower taxes, looking at bracket creep and making the system simpler. That's the Treasury officials were obliged to explain that was the rationale for this particular piece of legislation. And of course, during the course of this inquiry, we were quite disappointed by the lack of disclosure on the part of the government. And whereas we are entitled to know the total cost over the 11-year period of the personal income tax plan, which is roughly $144 billion, we of course know what the cost of the plan is over the forward estimates. But in the intervening years, we were not privileged or not trusted with the information as to the annual costings in that intervening period, and which is an absolutely ridiculous situation, where the Treasury people were prevented from disclosing that information. We know that they've done the analysis, but it fell to the Parliamentary Budget Office when I wrote to the Parliamentary Budget Officer to call for some detail around the costings in relation to the government's plan. So we were able to see a breakdown of the 7 components of the income tax plan. The Treasury officials were basically instructed to advise us that the figures were too uncertain, and despite the fact that we asked them to indicate, well, please tell us that information, but you can put caveats around it, put qualifications, give us confidence intervals as to what degree of weight we can place on it, but they were not prepared to divulge that information. And that is just that is a ridiculous situation when we are talking about income tax cuts which are going to cost the budget $144 billion over the longer period. Now, this is fiscal recklessness on a grand scale, and all of this, we are assured we're going to see a return to surplus by the end of the forward estimates, but on the present projections, we are looking at something less than 1% of GDP as in terms of the final surplus figure. That is a wafer-thin surplus. And during the course of estimates, I had the opportunity to ask the head of Treasury, Mr. Fraser, about his views in terms of the risks associated with the global economy going forward, and he was very unequivocal about the fact that we now have heightened risks on in the geopolitical area. So that is a huge question mark over the amount of weight that we can place on that and the level of risk associated with this plan. We heard during the course of our Senate inquiry that there are a number of assumptions that the budget makes which underpin this surplus, which are some might describe as heroic assumptions. The fact that we've got productivity growth in the budget of 1.6%, which is double the average that we've seen historically since the GFC, so an historic assumption. Migration, there were assumptions that were made there. When it comes to wages growth, that's probably the greatest area of concern. We've seen the rate of wages growth there that underpins the budget of 3.5%, and there were modelling done during the course of our inquiry which showed that if, for example, the wages growth was 1% lower than what was being projected, that would have a $39 billion per annum impact on the budget in terms of revenue. And of course the other area that we're concerned about is in the area of terms of trade. And as I indicated previously, we are going to an area or a period of time of global uncertainty, and if we do have global shocks, then that does also have the potential to impact on our terms of trade. So all of these assumptions there are very nice for the government to put that forward on the basis of this surplus, but I think we are really adopting a very risky approach. Now, we need to have long-term sustainability when it comes to the budget, and when we're talking about the sorts of revenue that we're looking at here, and we need to ensure that as we go forward, that we need to have revenue coming forward through which is going to pay for the essential services which Australians rely on, so things like health and education, infrastructure. The moment we see any of these shocks impacting on the budget, we know that a future coalition government cannot be trusted in terms of cuts to health, education and infrastructure. We also saw some of the assumptions that were underpinning the budget in terms of behavioural impacts, and where we see the budget being directed, the tax cuts being directed at the higher income end, and we saw that Grattan advised us that changes to marginal income tax rates do not provide much of a disincentive to work for people in the higher income area when it comes to additional hours. Now, they would have been better advised to take the $1 billion from the tax cuts to the wealthy and instead put it into childcare, and that would certainly encourage greater workforce participation. The changes that come in with respect to the personal income tax package really are not directed at achieving anything useful. Now, so I would just want to also mention here that this government is doing nothing about the rising gig economy, underemployment, stagnating wages, cuts to penalty rates, the theft of superannuation and the gender gap. They are crippled when it comes to energy policy and ripping billions of dollars out of our education and health systems, and yet they want to give billions of dollars to multinationals and banks. In contrast, Labor would give people earning less than $125,000 a year a bigger tax cut. We believe in a better, bigger and fairer tax system. Under our plan, more than 4 million ordinary Australian workers would be $398 better off each and every year. and Labor is taking action to help working Australians with other cost of living pressures, investing in our hospitals and our schools. We are uncapping an extra 200,000 places at university, and we'll review and invest in a TAFE system that's been neglected for years. And of course, today is National TAFE Day, so we should be celebrating our TAFE system. These are measures that are proven to create jobs and foster economic growth. Labor can do these things because we won't be giving out massive tax handouts to business and banks. Labor has a bigger, better, fairer plan for our tax system, and we are ready for government.